Here we are, plumb on the limestone belt. The term, though widely accepted, is in fact an oversimplification, but it'll serve. Serve to describe that great band of natural stone which runs from Portland Bill north and northeast in a great OG curve to the Humber and beyond. We're at the point where the limestone is pierced by the Avon. Not Stratford's Avon here, but the river which flows through Bath and Bristol. A few miles away to the southeast are the chalk downs of Wiltshire. All hilly, as Daniel Defoe wrote in 1724, and feeding vast flocks of sheep, a prodigious number of them. These, then, are the two commodities, stone and wool, that dominate the history of one of England's most attractive small industrial towns, Bradford on Avon in Wiltshire. Like many a town, this one is all the better for being built on a steep slope. And for such a small place, the number of handsome houses is remarkable. The name Bradford takes us back to those distant days before there was a bridge. It was originally Broad Ford. Wool was the staple industry here for over 500 years. At first, they sold their fleeces to be worked upon elsewhere. But before the end of the 14th century, a cloth-making industry was established at Bradford itself, which, except for a short break under the early Stuarts, flourished right on into the 19th century. In the valley arose a succession of cloth mills, ending with two very big ones. Kingston Mill on the left here, built in 1811 and demolished in 1972, and Abbey Mill, built only in 1875, the last cloth mill to be erected in the west of England, and converted to other uses from 1968. Then, up the hill, and prominent on the skyline, is the old rug factory. This became an engineering works, and is now being converted for domestic use. In the early years of the 19th century, there were no fewer than 32 cloth mills here. Bradford was famous for its broadcloth. This was a fine but very heavy felted cloth, which required specially big looms, sometimes as much as 100 inches wide. All the finishing and dyeing of the cloth was also done in the town. This was a terrace of 18 cloth workers' houses. About 20 years ago, after becoming very dilapidated, they were converted into 5 good houses. Higher up the hill is this terrace, erected in 1697, also originally for cloth workers. And from here we can climb again by steps to the narrow street known as Torre. Sometimes it's known delightfully as top rank Torre. This, I hasten to add, has no connection whatever with the upper echelons of the Conservative government. The name derives from the word tor, meaning a high place. What were once workers' cottages stand alongside Georgian terrace houses. Some of the houses still have back kitchens in caves, hewn out of the precipitous hillside. The top men, the master clothiers, were often very well housed indeed. Most of their houses are Georgian, but this one, known as the Old Manor House, is a little earlier. In fact, the part on the right there clearly goes back to the 17th century. All we notice is stone, and indeed on the main block, ashlar. That's to say sawn blocks, squared and finely jointed and laid in level courses. The roofs also are delightful, with the stone slates carefully graded from the largest at the base to the smallest at the ridge in the absolutely correct way. The windows were no doubt originally casements. They're a little too wide to have been Georgian. But towards the end of the 18th century, they were, nevertheless, sashed. And the preservation of the delicate glazing bars is absolutely vital to the good appearance of the house. Compare the effect with this one, which is also of two dates. This is a 17th century house which was given a fine new front, ashlar again, in the 18th century. And then, in the 19th century, they took out the glazing bars of the downstairs windows, thinking that they would improve their views of the garden. What a price to pay. Another handsome house, all Georgian this time, illustrates the point again. This one is in Kingston Road and is now offices. The glazing bars could be restored at comparatively little cost, but with enormous improvement to the visual impact of the building. At Westbury House, the bars have recently been put back, and as this house is very conspicuously sited, just across the town bridge, thousands of people must have felt grateful to the new owners, for the house looks almost unbelievably better than it used to. The south front is the most spectacular, with a central feature which verges on the Baroque. The fine quality of the stone ensures that the carved details still preserve their crispness. In this house, in 1800, was born a future Lord Chancellor. Richard Bethel became Lord Westbury, and that's why it bears its present name. A stone's throw away, a somewhat smaller house with a fine ashlar front preserves all its original windows intact. The rather thick glazing bars are a sure indication of an early Georgian date. In a letter of 1724, Defoe wrote, "They told us at Bradford that it was no extraordinary thing to have clothiers worth from £10,000 to £40,000 a man, large sums in those days, and many of the great families who now pass for gentry have been originally raised from and built up by this truly noble manufacture." Noble houses, too. At Church House, dated 1732, we have a Venetian window. Indeed, with its delicate Ionic pilasters, this window is the feature of the house. The raised eyebrow pediments over the first floor windows give this house a faintly quizzical air. Overall, these houses do convey a most affluent impression. But the finest of all the clothiers' houses, and the most unexpected, is just outside the town to the west, Belcombe Court. Clothing was manufactured on this site before the end of the Middle Ages, and the still existing barn dates from that time. The gabled building is also much older than the Georgian era, and indeed the Yerbury family were already prominent as Bradford clothiers under the Tudors. When they came here isn't known exactly, but it was Francis Yerbury who in 1734 decided to add on a new Palladian wing. For this he employed the leading architect in the southwest at that time, none other than John Wood the Elder of Bath. Wood certainly did him proud in every sense of the word. For a very proud building this is, wearing a great air of authority, with a big pediment rising above a strong entablature, supported by smooth Ionic pilasters. Wood himself, never renowned for his modesty, declared that these pilasters were the best that hath yet been executed in or about Bath. The stone for Wood's addition certainly came from the Westwood quarry, which is only about a mile away. What distinguishes this stone are the small, hard, brownish discolorations, which are in fact nodules of iron. They're not really blemishes. On the contrary, they add interest. The interior has two specially fine rooms. The study is masterly, a small and lofty octagon with exquisite wood carving round the windows and on the shutters. It's specially well seen above the two niches made for the display of china. But the plasterwork of the ceiling is the showpiece. Graceful swags of leaves, rosebuds and grapes adorn the cove, to culminate at the centre in a design of rollicking cherubs, 6 of them, encircling a basket full of fruit and flowers mysteriously suspended from the clouds. Who these wonderful craftsmen were isn't known. The drawing room, which Wood called the parlour, has a ceiling which may be by a different plasterer. The ornamentation isn't so profuse as in the study, nor is the relief so bold. But Lepidopterus will no doubt relish the butterflies, and even wonder whether one of them may be a bee. The garden is a precious survival, albeit on a fairly modest scale. There's a grotto, a Doric tempietto on a knoll, a serpentine pool, and a rustic cottage, perhaps here recalling the original dwellings of the clothworkers. It's an almost perfect example of the landscape style of William Kent, what the French called the Jardin Anglais. Needless to say, this is the art that conceals art. The naturalness was all most carefully contrived. The Yerburys continued to live at Belcombe Court until the beginning of the present century. Lucky people. Not everyone, though, was so fortunate. Clothing was, I'm afraid, a sweated industry. The spinners in the hamlets and scattered cottages of the vicinity endured a pretty miserable existence. Most of their cottages were timber-framed, and in the town itself in the Middle Ages, timbered buildings were much more in evidence than they are now. Survivors, indeed, are very few. But timber does survive, and on a grand scale, in one of Bradford's most exciting buildings. Barton Farm, Tithe Barn, is one of the most spectacular in England. It was the property of the nunnery of Shaftesbury, and is now, very rightly, a national possession under the care of the Department of the Environment. This splendid barn, which is no less than 168 feet long, is therefore larger than many churches. Its most spectacular feature is the massive oak roof, arch-braced, with no fewer than 3 tiers of wind braces throughout its entire length. But outside, except for the doors of what might perhaps be called the transepts, there's no wood to be seen anywhere. The walls are of limestone, and so is the roof, one of the great sights of Bradford. Stone slates in their thousands on an unusually steep pitch. These slates, or stone tiles as some people prefer to call them, come from a formation known to geologists as the Forest Marble, and probably from a village called Atworth, about 4 miles away to the northeast. Bath stone itself is not naturally fissile. That means to say it can't be split into thin slices. And herein lies, if I may mix my metaphors, Bradford's Achilles' heel. In any general view of the town, the one in a harmonious note visually is the profusion of red roofs, which consort ill with the limestone. Though not right here, the Pantours from Bridgewater are certainly the most acceptable. Some of the machine-produced tiles really are very poor indeed. Such niggling designs, too. Others are concrete. These are often better designed, but unpleasing in texture. If, for financial reasons, an artificial product has to be used, how very much to be preferred are these reconstituted stone slates, which are right in colour and graded in the traditional manner. For walling, however, natural stone is still available at a price. Until the Industrial Revolution, the great inhibiting factor in the use of heavy materials like stone for house building was the cost of transport. But at Bradford, this didn't apply. The town stands on stone. Its hills are honeycombed with quarry workings, most of them shallow mines, which can go in as much as a mile. Their rather precarious roofs have been known to fall in. That is not likely to happen here, but still, I'm taking no chances. At the quarry face, some 300 yards from the entrance, they have a stone-cutting machine which does in an hour what used to take a man a fortnight of very hard labour. This block of stone weighs nearly 4 tons. It's oolitic limestone, which for the builder is much the most important strand in the Jurassic system of rocks. On the oolite are situated a string of famous quarries like Portland and Purbeck, Chilmark, Dolting, Corsham, Tainton, Guyting, Weldon, Ketton, Clipsham, Ancaster. Those are only some which have made a really tremendous contribution to our architectural heritage. Not all, alas, are still worked, but this one, westward, is. For a long time it was closed, but recently it has been reopened. Like Corsham, it produces what's known generically as Bath stone, and a very famous stone that was and is. We've already encountered Westwood stone at Belcombe Court. This is the only one of Bradford's quarries which is now working, but there are plenty of others, and for some of them alternative uses have been found. This one, Bethel, has been given over to mushroom culture, for which it's ideal. About 80 people now earn their living here. Kingsfield Quarry, long disused, today provides a picturesque backdrop to the garden of a modern house. So, as early as 1540, Leland was able to record that the town is made all of stone. Nevertheless, it wasn't all good stone, even though it was oolitic limestone. On another clothier's house, as we can see, the state of the stonework is rather poor and hasn't weathered well. Much worse is the condition of the majestic Avon Cliff Aqueduct a mile west of the town. This is one of two which John Rennie built about 1804 to carry the Kennet and Avon Canal across the river. This stone was obtained from a quarry a few hundred yards away that was opened specially. It could hardly have been worse selected. The brick patching is a real eyesore. Only the parapets, which came from different beds, have proved more durable. It was this canal, opened in 1810 and now in process of restoration, which first made it feasible to send Bath stone all over the country. In this trade, Bradford had its share. By 1840, There were about 100 men working in the Winsley quarries quite near to this bridge. In the 1850s, the railway arrived to share the valley with the river and the canal, and for a short time this improved still further the distribution of the stone. But the heyday of the local stone industry did not endure. And after the woolen trade migrated to Yorkshire, the cloth mills stood empty. Bradford, therefore, was all too willing to hail the advent of a new industry, and as chance would have it, a remarkable man was waiting in the wings, Stephen Moulton. He had obtained from Charles Goodyear in America the British patent for the vulcanization of rubber. He was looking for labour and for a factory, and in Bradford he found both. The rubber industry was first established in Thomas Divitt's cloth mill. Stephen Moulton also bought the hall, which was then, according to the editor of Aubrey's Natural History of Wiltshire, woefully degraded and mutilated. But because part of it had long been in use as a wool store, it was luckily not quite ruinous. The close relationship between house and mill persisted until a few years ago. The hall had been the finest house in Bradford, and thanks to the Moultons, is so once again. It's also the only large house in this town whose existence is not directly dependent upon a clothing fortune. The family, whose name oddly enough was Hall, had been clothiers. John Hall, who died in 1515, owned no fewer than 10 mills here, including 3 devoted to the beating and cleansing of cloth, what's known as fulling. But by the time this house was built, the Halls had become gentry and landowners. Their mills were let out. They'd made good marriages. The hall was built about 1600 near, or perhaps on the site of, an earlier house. And even at a very showy moment for English architecture, it stands out as a spectacular piece of display. This house is both a home and an office, and one of the principal rooms is the study of the present owner, Stephen Moulton's great-grandson. A particular pleasure is to sit in one of these lobe-shaped bay windows, looking along this exciting front. Something that can be matched in a very few early Tudor houses, but in no other Elizabethan example. The garden front really does look to be more glass than wall, and we're struck at once by the immense loftiness of the fenestration. In this, it's very reminiscent of the almost contemporary Hardwick Hall, that prodigious late Elizabethan house in Derbyshire. Another house which inspired the craftsmen of Bradford was nearby Longleat. Here the analogy lies in the elaborate ornamentation. Inset circles, for example, between the 2 tiers of windows. As a cresting for the 3 bays, there are bigger, pierced circles, carrying spearhead finials. It could hardly be more exuberant. Now, the stone for this house came from Coombe Quarry, a mine in the grounds not more than 300 yards away. Like a lot of stone in this area, it can be ashlarred and is quite easy to carve. For the east side of the house, which was originally only the service side, they were content to use only rubble stone for the walling material. But the residential side, facing the bowling green to the west, like the show front facing south, was faced entirely with ashlar. And since these are the two faces of the house most exposed to the weather, it's certain that the stonework was in a fairly bad state of decay, on the south front especially, when Stephen Moulton acquired the property in 1848. With only one or two variations, he had everything copied with the most careful accuracy. That the garden front is now largely a 19th century reproduction is entirely due to the relatively friable character of this beautiful looking stone. But Stephen Moulton went to the same quarry again. And after 130 years, I challenge anyone who didn't know about the refacing to have any serious reason for doubting that this house is not only a product, but also a masterpiece of the last years of Queen Elizabeth I. The hall is a private house and not open to the public. But Bradford, which is still very much a working town, has yet other things to offer. Some people, of course, come here primarily to see the little Saxon church of St. Lawrence. This was probably built in the 10th century, but has had to be drastically reconstructed. Before 1857, its very existence was for several centuries unknown. So much had it been altered and hemmed in by other buildings. Because complete Saxon churches are so rare, this one, even in its present state, is of great historical interest. Artistically, its appeal is more limited. Another object of popular attention is the town bridge. What people go for here is the so-called blind house, a 17th century lock-up in the centre of the bridge on the site of the former chapel. Its copper-gilt weather vane is in the form of a fish, the Bradford gudgeon. So, you see, this small place has a lot to offer. But apart from the splendid hall, it is visually the Georgian inheritance that really counts. Quite un-Georgian in its layout, this compact town, built of pale yellow limestone on a splendidly hilly site, is full of Georgian delights.
You might like to know that since Alec Clifton Taylor visited Bradford on Avon in 1981, the canal is now fully restored and you can go by water all the way to Bath and Bristol.